When I was a kid in Catholic school, initially I had pretty much two primary heroes, St. Francis of Assisi and John Lennon of Liverpool. And St. Francis taught me about the mystical madness of what love means and the mad beauty of applying the energy of love that's inside of you to every single being that you meet. And he also taught me how to not get trapped in materialism. And John Lennon taught me pretty much those same things. In 1964, my mother took me to a movie. She was a wonderful and brilliant, open-hearted, liberal, loving, compassionate being. And she supported all of my interests in the arts all of her life. She took me to see A Hard Day's Night at the Stony Brook Drive-In Theater, the Beatles' first film. She talked about how beautiful Paul McCartney's eyes were. And then in the next 2 months after that, I took all of my friends and we went to see, at all the different theaters around New York, we went to see A Hard Day's Night 24 times. The really wonderful thing for me about the Beatles and about Bob Dylan was that they showed me something I thought was very important from an elder to a child. They showed me not to look for heroes out there. They showed me how to turn deeply within. And they led me to a lifelong practice of sitting meditation and poetry, song, painting. So there are many teachers in my life. One of them, I'm going to tell you about two of them. These are two things that happened to me. One when I was a child, another when I was about 40. Two of my teachers, let's begin with Thich Quang Duc. I was about 8 years old, 9 years old, something like that, in 1963, and I was sitting with my parents in their suburban TV room, and we were watching the Huntley-Brinkley Report. And who should appear on the screen but this Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc. Maybe you know the name. Thich Quang Duc immolated himself in the streets of Saigon in protest of the Vietnam War. I'm 8 years old and I'm watching the news, and suddenly I'm seeing this thing happening on the screen in front of me. This shaven-headed monk sits down in the middle of the street in this full meditation posture. Complete stillness. He's been doused with gasoline and he lights the flame and he goes up in flames. They rise 6-8 feet above his head, and he continues to sit in silent, still meditation, not moving. I'm watching this, a child, and I don't know exactly what's happening, but I get this sense that something incredibly important is happening that pretty much nobody could fully understand. And then this impossible moment happens because his body begins to crumble. His body cannot handle the flames that his will is refusing to be run down by. So he's sitting in this meditation posture, and his body begins to crumble to the side. It's falling over to the right. I'm watching this, and I remember crying out in the room when this monk reached down with his hand and pushed himself back up into that posture. He was that committed, and he burned for truth. Move ahead a few years, 1995. Let me finish with Taekwondo. Let me say that in a very short time after that, though by the time I was maybe 10 years old, I was absolutely committed that I would be a pacifist my entire life, that I would not serve in any military endeavors, that I would not go to war, that I would not carry a weapon ever in my life, that I would participate in no act of violence against anyone. Quite a few years later, 1995, and I go to Baltimore to see another Buddhist monk speak. His name is Tenzin Shodrak, and he was at that time in his late 60s, and he was a traditional Buddhist monk from Tibet, and he was one of the Dalai Lama's personal physicians. And when the Chinese invaded Tibet, Tenzin Shodrak did not escape. He was arrested and placed in a concentration camp. I saw him speak that night, and he didn't speak English. He had two other younger monks who were his interpreters, and they explained to us everything that he was saying. And then he agreed that the next morning he would see however many people wanted to come to him as patients at no charge. So the people all, lined up. I called my mother, my wonderful mother, because she was suffering at that time with some sort of a large growth under her ear, and she was terrified about what it might be, and it had been there for months. So I took her to see Tenzin Shodrak, and he placed his hands on her neck and closed his eyes and sunk into a stillness and a silence. And then suddenly some little Tibetan sounds started to rise up out of his lips. And then he just let go of her and went on to the next patient. The next day, that growth on my mother's neck opened up and healed itself within 2 days' time. That's not the end of the story. I got to spend an amazing amount of time with one of his translators, one of these other young monks, and this guy told me Tenzin Shodrak's story. Tenzin Shodrak was sent to that prison camp by the Chinese, and while he was there, he was tortured for some part of every day for 17 years. 17 years. And he vowed, because of the disciplines he'd spent his life studying, he vowed that he would never sink into hatred or anger towards these people. And every day when they would come to him with razors and knives and clubs and fire and electrodes, and he saw what was coming, he would turn inward. And he said to himself over and over again, "This teaches me patience. This teaches me patience." 17 years. One day, the guy who ran the camp, the head officer, Chinese officer, got very sick and nobody knew what to do. And they kept trying to heal him, nothing was working, so they pulled Tenzin Shodrak up from the dungeon and said, "Fix him." So Tenzin Shodrak sent them into the mountains to get these roots and these herbs and so on. And he worked with the guy for 3 days, and then the officer was fully recovered. And the officer said, "I'm not supposed to do this, but there's at the door. I'm going to turn my back now." And so Tenzin Shodrak then, after 17 years of torture, walked freely out of the concentration camp and went to India, where he rejoined the Dalai Lama. Because he refused to sink into hatred, because he chose the path of forgiveness, he survived. And he did more than survive, he thrived in his life. True heroism is in forgiveness. So I've had many, many teachers, and these are 2 of them. And if I look at what I've learned from all of them, it always comes back to the same thing. There's a question that every human being needs to ask himself or herself. Will my life be ruled by love, or will my life be ruled by fear? Every other emotion we could possibly look at is a subset of one of those 2. Love or fear. Choose.